I'm gonna start. Okay, you can grab your mic. That's good.
Grab my mic.
It
Hello.
has the mic.
It's the mic from my computer. It's not this mic.
Yeah.
Is that a problem?
It'll be fine. Your mic from the computer.
It's fine. Yeah.
So.
Oh, it has the mic. Oh, that's fun.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, and the thing's fixed.
Yeah.
Holy shit! Yeah,
Okay,
Go
finish.
onto YouTube and see what happens. Oh, I'll go onto YouTube. I don't know. Someone go onto YouTube.
It looks kind of stretched. It'll be fine.
What's the problem? It'll be right. It's fine. Don't worry.
It'll be fine.
What's the channel? Is it
Game Makers.
Game Makers?
Okay, we need to add that to the Discord announcement as well. Right. Check it.
Is it Unimeld Game Makers Club?
I don't. It's very long. It's a very long name.
Well, that's nice.
I
found it. It's currently live.
Nice.
But what happens if I start watching myself? Yeah, I've got like same thing you do.
Yeah.
Sit down. Yeah, sit down. Everyone, sit down. Make yourself.
Take a seat. Okay, it's there. I'll upload this presentation.
There's not much latency either. Oh, I'm taking that presentation?
No, this one.
This one?
I'm gonna upload it to everyone.
Okay, so I
It's the
leave
same
this
one,
one
it's
as
the
it
same
is?
one,
Yeah, cool.
And then I'll just
Sweet.
You know?
Go for it.
Nice.
I did.
Alrighty.
Okay, I'll post the YouTube invite.
I guess like
How are we on the Discord?
Hours in is Counter Strike. Steven is Discord stuff happening. But it wouldn't count as a story game. When it comes to like single player games, I think they give
Where's my pointy thing?
generally.
Here it is. Thank you.
See how it looks with the.
Huzzah!
Oh,
I
nice!
actually didn't start Elden yet because I was like, I need to finish every Dark Souls before that, and it turns out they are fucking long games.
So, we don't need any more information, right? We just need somewhere for them to download the PowerPoint.
So
Yes, man.
I finished the first and second, and I'm like at the fifth boss with
Check
I need to finish that. I can play Elden Ring. I think for the second took me like
I'll leave it
50 hours.
I make it enough. I should. I'm just gonna sign up.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Really fun. I think for Dark Souls 2 I did the big mistake of saying, I want to do something else, a different build to Dark Souls 1, so I was thinking, I do a full-on mage build. Mage build in Dark Souls 2. Oh my gosh, no, that's no fun, I tell you. What I carried through. It was no fun, especially at the beginning where you get, what, 15 projectiles? That's enough to kill like 3 enemies.
You just have to basically like farm it until they despawn.
Yeah, that's what I did. It was like the worst grind I ever did in a game.
Well, you suddenly have the endurance for Dark Souls. Okay.
Yeah.
I cannot defeat the first enemy and activate.
I feel you. The solution to that is spend additionally 3 hours, and then you'll learn the anime and then you go
Bash your head into
yeah,
it.
just bash your head.
It will work. It will work. Eventually, statistically, it has to work, right?
If you just spend enough time, you eventually have fun.
I don't think it's fun.
Hurrah! Welcome, Suja. How are you? Yeah, it says nothing as well, but that's next door.
I think it's quite. Have you heard the name of it?
I don't know what
It's quite.
Have you played in your Sims? Any new
Yes, I think it's terrible.
Or the UI sucks. Well, actually, gameplay, I like it from the gameplay perspective. I haven't played a single player yet, so I think always if you play with someone else, then it's definitely good more.
I think it's too hard to play with somebody else who's not like the normal players. Like you play it
It's always a good for someone always takes like 2 minutes for it stream.
and as the game goes on, you get more and more units, and everything seems so complicated. I can't stand it. And so I want to say to do and you cannot finish it.
Yeah. The fun thing with that is because I'm German, so most of my friends, which I would still play, are from Germany. And let's be honest, most of the games suck and they're big. But civilization's fine.
It's all turn-based, right?
Yeah.
So I recall someone fighting game wait for 2 years after all the others.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Yeah, the time costs like $200. No,
If you get it in a sale, then
so fancy pre-order. You're basically paying them for like
yeah, that's basically it. But I feel like that's what most games do. Try to avoid ruining.
You mocking me? Don't mock me. It's beautiful. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are we able to move it to the corner, Taha? Does that work? Are we just gonna leave it there? Or maybe we can just leave it there. No, it's fine. Just leave it. Just leave it.
Oh, do you have time to add something more? Oh, no, we can just, I didn't know, just leave it outside. And then it's really
Alright. How's everyone doing this evening? This is where I'm supposed to do crowd work or something before we start. How are we all doing? How are you doing? How are you people doing?
Should I shut the door to like?
Yeah, maybe in a couple minutes, but just like for a little bit. Otherwise, we'll worry people won't find us. I can change the lighting. Should I change the lighting? Yeah, okay.
I have no clue what's happening next door, but it's sure build up.
What's happening next?
It's like the Malaysian club. They're having a games night. So,
Oh,
people
so
play lots of games.
It's like twice this building.
Yeah, it's like-
it's old building. It's crazy.
Always kidding. Wow, that's not my workshop.
There must be some free pizza.
Pizza has 3 movies.
That's good stuff. Well, no, we have free pizza.
Alrighty, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the GMC/Claws narrative workshop. I'm your lovely host Jasper, and tonight we're going to talk about, I guess, narrative in games. So what's the vibe like with you guys? Like, how many people here from GMC? How many people from Claws? How many people just sort of saw it on Insta? we got any people from Claws here? Hey, welcome. Any people from GMC? Okay, most. Makes sense. I'm also from GMC. Okay, hope you feel welcome. And did anyone here just happen to see it on Instagram and decide to rock up? Welcome as well. Alright, great. Okay, so let's get started. So, I'm just going to do what I want to do. That's the most important question. Alright, so who am I? I'm Jasper. I'm with the GMC and I'm a hobbyist game developer in my own time. So I'm super interested in game narrative just from a sort of a hobbyist perspective. In particular with game development, I'm into how we can use, in particular, NPCs to create stories. And sort of the intersections between NPC AI and storytelling and procedural narratives, that sort of stuff. But tonight we're going to talk about just lots of different kinds of narrative in games. The different structures it can take, so stuff like linear narrative, branching narrative, and some other more experimental structures. So hopefully there'll be something interesting for you. The lights, yeah, okay. So hopefully there'll be something interesting for you, and maybe something to take away for your own, either writing or making games, or whatever you're interested in.
Should be AV.
Is it AV? Yeah, okay, that one.
Or maybe just
It's an off button. Hello, there we go. All right. And so, in terms of that, we're having on the GMT Discord, which we will post put a link for a little bit later, if you want to join in, we're having a narrative design challenge over the next week or so, which is basically an opportunity for you to sort of give us a pitch for what a game narrative could be. So, like, if you wanted to come up with a really quick little story and be like, okay, I'm going to make it structure it like this, and it's going to have this kind of gameplay or something like that. It's kind of just an idea. Why did I like that? It's kind of just an idea for a game narrative that you might like to write. If you happen to be inspired by anything we talked about today, or anything you think is like, oh, that's really interesting, I want to try and plan out something and see how that goes. But for now, let's get to the presentation. That's fine, who cares? Oh, next room of trolling. Right, okay. Yeah, once again, someone's going to do something about that. Anyway, alright. So I guess the fundamental question we've got to ask ourselves is, what is narrative for games? Which is, a bit corny. It's a bit sort of like English teacher. Oh, what is narrative for games? But I think there are a couple of questions that are sort of nestled within this one. So number one is, what is narrative? And then secondly, what is narrative for games? What is specifically special about narrative for games as opposed to, say, like narrative for film or narrative for a TV show or something like that? Right. So when we make stories, it's perhaps a little bit boring, a little bit theoretical, but it's important to think about. When we create stories, we need to be aware of what the medium we are creating with is. So, because there are different rules and different sort of structures that come with each one. So when we write books, right, I mean, what's a book? It's a bunch of words, right? It's a bunch of words. There's no, like, pictures in a book in general, unless you're, like, 3 years old, in which case, I mean, you do you. But what that means is there's lots and lots of text. So your way of creating meaning is through lots and lots of text. And you can use that to do like narration. You can use the words in special ways to make metaphors or whatever you want to do. But generally speaking, it's the way you manipulate those words that's going to create meaning. Something like visual description is going to be all subjective, right? As opposed to like, I don't know, a TV show where I can show you an image and everyone knows what that looks like. Instead, you have to sort of come up with it in your mind's eye or whatever. Compare that to like theatre. And we do get that visual element, right? I can show you something on a stage. I can do some sort of action. I can read a line of dialogue in a certain way that kind of clears up some of that ambiguity that exists in, say, a book. It has its own sort of language and its own sort of conventions. It has stuff like props, stuff like blocking, which is sort of where on the stage people are, and that can create meaning as well. But it's also got this quirk, which is like, okay, let's say you're at the theatre, and there's one character, and they're going to like shoot another character with a gun. Right? Okay, so I'm this one character, I'm this other character, bang, whatever, right? Nobody's expecting that necessarily to look real, right? I mean, would anyone here genuinely expect that to look real at the theatre? Maybe. Alright. Well, let me know if you do see a play that manages to genuinely do that, because I'd be interested. But I think that there's this general understanding when we go see a play, or something like that, that it doesn't have to look real. Right? It's the term for it is suspension of disbelief, kind of that idea of you don't do that thing where you go to the movies and go, oh, that couldn't possibly happen like that. We just accept it's theatre. And then movies and TV shows are kind of different, right? Because now, if I'm to shoot someone on a TV show, we've got special effects. We've got something that we're trying to make it look a bit more real. The visual language, even though there is visuals at the theatre, is quite different then in that way. There's lots of difference too. It tends to be that the sets in like a movie or a TV show are going to be more like detailed than in a theatre production, right? And we can have lots more variety in sets. I can have a scene that's set in Australia. I can have a scene that's set in Antarctica. And I can really make it look real in a way that I can't on the theatre stage. So the question is, what's our equivalent in games? So here's an example from a film that I've recently had to study for class, and I thought this was an interesting sort of snapshot. And this is one of those films that everyone's like, oh, it's an old film, it like invented cinema or whatever. But it's kind of this idea of visual storytelling, and you probably can't quite see because it's in black and white, but here this one character's been given this like cup of soup to drink. He takes a sip of it and he goes, wah! And sort of the implication there, it's like, well, what does that mean? You can pretty easily tell. He thinks it's disgusting, he doesn't want to drink it, he throws it away. But that's not been told through words. He doesn't say, oh my goodness, I think this soup is disgusting. It's something that's been shown through the medium of film, through the visuals. So the question is, can we do the same with games? There are lots of different ways to do it through games. Some of the more obvious or more well-known ones are stuff like emergent narrative. Emergent narrative is very interesting because it's the idea of basically telling stories through gameplay systems rather than through any explicit sort of writing. So who here has played Civilization? Yeah, right. Okay, a lot of people have played Civilization. Don't worry if you haven't. Have you ever, when you played Civilization, sort of come up with this headcanon of like, oh my god, I hate this guy. This guy's totally against me. He's my arch enemy. He's, building teams with all these other people. We're gonna stop him. We're gonna create a world war or whatever. Like that's happened to all of us in Civilization, right? But that's not actually something that developers sat down and wrote, right? Nobody sat down and wrote. In this case, I believe this is Peter from Russia. Nobody sat down and wrote the idea that Peter from Russia is going to be your arch enemy and he's going to do this and he's going to do that. That's something that emerged quite naturally from the game's systems, what they are in that game. And so I think that's probably our best equivalent of the film example we just looked at, where entirely through visuals a story is being told. But there are more examples. Something like The Sims, right? Who here has funny stories from The Sims? You ever played The Sims? Do you have any funny stories from The Sims? Not that you're sharing? Fair enough. Example, someone said the other night, the idea that do you ever done that thing where you strap your Sims in a pool and they drown? Yeah, you're nodding there. Did that, I feel like if I were to do that, man, this is just me. If I were to do that, I'd be like, oh my goodness, I'm like some pool serial killer. I'm gonna strike again. I'm gonna start doing it over and over and over again, and create this whole sort of meta plot in my head of, oh my god, we're using pools to murder people or whatever. But again, the designers of the game did not write that. That is not a script that someone wrote. That is not a story that was written by the EA. But that is something that emerged, hence emergent, as a result of the game's systems. So that's interesting. And I think it's a very valuable story. Something like Dwarf Fortress is known for having enormous amounts of stories in it. But again, they're all just a result of systems, if you've played that. Okay. Another way is through environmental storytelling, which I like to think of almost as like set design in games. So the equivalent of having props around the place that can tell the story. So a very typical example is you ever play those games where there's audio logs around and you listen to the audio logs and it's like, oh my god, I don't know, there's been a nuclear explosion and something like that. But that tells you about the world. That's often used for world building. And so, for example, a game like Bioshock, which is in the background here, and lots of games we've got an abandoned society, they use the props and they use the graphics and how things look. So things might look decayed, things might look broken, that sort of thing, to tell the story in a way that isn't, again, a line of text. Okay. So a related question and another example of environmental storytelling is people often say that something like Grand Theft Auto, compared to other open world games, people often say it feels really alive. That's a very sort of subjective thing to say, but I think one of the reasons why people might say that is because of the extent to which they use environmental storytelling. Here is a screenshot from Grand Theft Auto 4. Just a bunch of billboards and advertisements from that game. And the Grand Theft Auto games are really interesting in this sense because they basically use advertising to create these brands and to create this world building. So you might see an ad for what they call E-Cola, which is their equivalent of Coca-Cola, and you're going to see that everywhere in the game. And so in this particular game, on like all the taxis, there's advertising for a reality TV show called America's Next Top Hooker. And the whole thing there is it's creating this sort of this consistency in the messaging and this world building, but also it tells us something about the world. So by having this ridiculous amount of advertising, it sort of nails in this sort of consumerist ridiculousness that's going on within the game. By having a reality TV show called America's Next Top Hooker, which is an incredibly misogynistic concept, it tells us this. It sort of tells us about the very lurid and very sort of voyeuristic elements of this society. There are advertisements for guns everywhere. Like buy a gun and protect yourself from terrorists, all that sort of thing. And the whole point is to really get across this idea of just the hysteria of New York under George Bush's America, that sort of thing. And so it's being used to tell a story. Another example, Hitman. Hitman's really great because it basically plays on your expectations of what you're seeing to inform you on how to behave. So in this game, you're being put into a bunch of random sort of scenarios, in this case like an Italian coastal village. And sort of the ideas of what you can and can't do are kind of informed by your assumptions of what you should be doing when you're just hanging out in a coastal village. So if I'm just walking down the street, I probably shouldn't pull out a gun and start shooting people, right? Because that would be a weird thing to do. And so the game doesn't have to tell me, hey, you can't do that. I just kind of know. As opposed to in other settings like this, where I go, okay, well, everyone else is in these cop disguises, we've got all this sort of we've got guns on the table, all sorts of things. Maybe that's going to inform your behavior in a different way. But that's all being communicated by the props and by the settings. And in this particular game, by the disguises mechanic where you can dress up as different people. But again, same thing. If I dress up as a police officer, I assume that lets me do different things than if I dress up as a shit, right? Because the game doesn't have to give me a checklist of here are the things you can and can't do in all these different disguises or settings or roles, but I get to sort of do the role play myself. That's quite powerful. So basically, the point I'm trying to make is that game narrative is not just a script. And we're basically going to be looking this evening at a bunch of different ways, from sort of peanut brain to galaxy brain, to be able to get that idea across. So in that, I like to think of game narrative as sort of a possibility space, rather than just like a script. Like when you read a book, you can experience a book in lots of different ways. You can interpret it in lots of different ways, but ultimately we're all reading the same book, right? You can argue about that from a lot of different literary perspectives, but ultimately we're all reading the same text. In a game, that's not the case. Everyone's interacting with the game in a different way. And so it's up to us to make that sort of space of interaction that you can have be interesting. Here's can we make that be broad, or does it have to be little? Whatever. So we're going to descend the iceberg a little bit and learn some cool techniques, and hopefully you all leave here galaxy brained on game narrative, and if you want to play in the narrative design challenge. But to do that, we've got to start at the basics, which is what most of us probably think about when we think about a game's narrative, and that's just a linear narrative. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Just like a book, just like a movie, anything like that. So, easiest example to sort of think about here is something like a Call of Duty campaign, right? You've got your first level, where maybe you're shooting some people in London, then you've got a second level, maybe you're shooting some people in Paris, and so on and so on and so forth. Shoot some people in New York, you shoot some people in Los Angeles. For the grand finale, that's it, right? It's level, 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 level. And no one's going to play, for example, this fourth mission first. There's not a thing. There's an order you complete them in. You go from start to finish, and that's it. So there's nothing... Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course. So there's nothing inherently wrong with that, necessarily. I'm not sort of bagging on Call of Duty because it's linear. There are lots of other criticisms of Call of Duty's story, but that's not necessarily one of them. I just think that it's a little bit restrictive in terms of the way in which it uses games as a medium to tell that story, right? There's nothing there that can be done in a TV show. And you can have a linear storyline that is very, very well loved and that is very, very good. I think everyone would agree that The Last of Us is a fantastic game with a fantastic story, but it is also linear, right? You have your starting scene, your middle scene, blah, 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 blah. You have your ending. There's only one ending, right? Everyone experiences that story in the same sort of order, but that doesn't make it a bad story. All I'm saying is, it could, for example, be a TV show. Oh, look, it was. Alright, so what are some things that some games do to spice that up a bit? Well, very common example, side quests. So, any like RPG you play, any Zelda game, anything like that's got side quests, right? Okay, I'm going off and fighting the big baddie, I'm fighting the monster. But now I'm going to stop and help this old lady find a cat. Right. What does that do for us? Well, it adds variety. Because it means that, let's say I get bored from the main storyline, I can go off and do these other fun things. It sort of keeps the pace a bit light. And it also means I can get super duper distracted and just not bother with the main quest. Happens all the time. Great. And because I get a choice in that, it makes me feel a bit more free as a player. So that's quite nice. And I don't feel as railroaded onto one path that I can't divert from, like in a Call of Duty mission, where if it's like, okay, I just shot some people, I don't really feel like shooting any more people. Too bad, you have to shoot more people. Okay, great. And they're normally optional, which means that sometimes there'll be content that a player just won't see. They'll get to the end of the game, and there'll be something that they haven't seen that their friend might. And so it creates that sort of unique experience, you know? Often there's like hidden secrets, Easter eggs, whatever. Right. But the thing is, it's still kind of just like another line in this whole linear idea. Because if I go and help the old lady with her cat, whatever, it doesn't really have anything to do with me fighting the big boss at the end of the game. It's kind of just an extra thing that's there. But ultimately, I still don't have control of the main content. So I still think of it as kind of linear, but it just spices things up a bit. Alright. Just take a sip. Another very typical concept is what's used in a lot of open world games and a lot of RPGs, which is this thing where they do like what's done in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which is, okay, you have your first mission, which is the, oh shit, here we go again mission. You have a couple others, I don't know, you have a drive-by shooting, you do all these things, blah, 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 blah. But eventually something kind of interesting happens. On your mini-map, you get multiple mission icons pop up, and then you get a choice. You basically get to decide which mission, it's what they call their sort of like bits of content, or like their quests. And you get a choice of which one you want to do next. And so, in the first couple hours of the game, this is actually what the flow of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas looks like. Every single player is going to complete the first few missions in this particular order, but after that, you can go to this one, you can go to this one, you can go to this one, blah, 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 doing whatever you already like. And that's great, because I, as a player, have some freedom. If I don't want to be hanging out with OG Loke stealing cars, I can go do something else. Perfect. But ultimately, every single player is going to experience all of these missions. You don't actually get the choice to just say, okay, I don't want to do this mission now. You will eventually have to do it before you can progress the story. You don't actually get a choice whether you want to do it. You just get a choice what order you want to do it in. So every single person in the first few hours of the game will hit all of these key plot points, resulting in this big set-piece betrayal that ends the first act, and then we move on and everyone's in the same place. Ultimately, every person is going to experience...
All we had to do was follow the damn train, CJ!
Similar examples in the early Zelda games. Fun fact that's not known by a lot of people is that in Ocarina of Time, you actually do get a choice between which order you would like to complete the dungeons in. So early on, you get the choice between, you have, in theory, the story tells you have to go do this second dungeon, the Dongo's Cavern first, and then move on and hang out in Jabu Jabu's belly to find some rock, which is very strange. But if you actually want to, you can do it in the opposite order. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. Same as later on when you get the Master Sword, here's a bunch of dungeons, the game tells you in order to do them, and you can actually kind of do whatever you want. In Zelda Breath of the Wild, the game presents you, hey, you have to go fight these 4 big monster things to complete the game. But you can do them in any order you like. That being said, you do ultimately have to do them all. Breath of the Wild is probably a little bit of a weird example of that, but that's beside the point. So, again, by mixing up the order of things, we do add a bit more player choice. But what could we do to actually give the player control over the content, rather than just the order they complete the content in? That's where we get to what most of us probably think about when we hear video game narrative or a narrative-based video game, which is branching narrative. The fundamental idea is everyone starts off the same, and that at some point you're going to have to make some sort of choice of the narrative that sort of puts you onto 2 different paths. And the promise that these games always give you, a very typical sort of like, the game will remember the choices you make sort of thing, is that this is going to have some sort of payoff later on. Maybe you'll get a different ending, maybe something like that. But it makes you feel like your choices matter. So probably the game that most heavily popularized this is Telltale's The Walking Dead, which is a very, very well written game, very, very good game. And the sort of the key gimmick of that game is that every so often, they present you with a choice. And that choice very often looks like something like this, where you have 2 characters who are being attacked by zombies or something, and you have to choose who you're going to save, and the other one's going to get eaten by zombies and die. So that's actually a pretty major choice that the game is presenting to you. Letting one character die versus the other not dying. It's completely unlike anything we saw in like the other games we just talked about. Because here, that's a permanent choice. It's not the case that if I save this person, later on, oh, okay, I can still do this person's side quests or whatever later on. No, that person's dead. And you got the choice to that. And as a writer, that is a very powerful thing. Because, if a character's gone, that changes the group dynamics, that changes the entire class dynamics, that changes everything. So it's actually quite a cool thing. But there's a bit of a problem with it. By the time I got to the third game in the Walking Dead series, I started to feel a little bit disillusioned with it. Because I started to notice that what the game would do is, okay, I get to choose between which of these characters is going to live and which of these characters is going to die, but then I started noticing that, okay, let's say I save this lady. Turns out within the next 2 hours or so, she's going to die anyway. And I was like, what? But I saved that lady. What do you mean she's dead? And then it happened again. The game was like, hey, you have to choose between these two characters. I save one, they die again in 3 hours' time anyway. And it's this sort of question of like, well, it kind of makes me feel like my choice didn't actually matter. Because I saved that person, and now the game is undoing that work that I did. So if we want to visualize this, we could do it with this sort of chart. We start the game, great, and here the game sort of splits off into two different parts. One where I save one person, one where I save the other. But then, the game, by deciding to kill the other character that I saved, it kind of forces both paths back onto the same path. You can think of it like a sort of a bottleneck. And so ultimately, if I showed you like two people playing the game at this point in the game, you probably wouldn't actually be able to tell who saved who. And that's kind of not great for us, because then the whole premise of these games is that your choices matter, but your choice doesn't really matter in the long term. Especially because these games are quite frequently don't actually have much gameplay. The premise tends to be the story is the game. If we kind of take away that element of what makes it a game, which is the fact that you get a choice of the story, it kind of just feels like you're just watching a 3-hour cutscene. And so it can sort of wear a bit thin. Even worse for me, whenever I noticed that the game was about to present to me a choice of two characters, I went, oh look, they're both going to die anyway. So now, it's kind of an anticlimax in that sense. It's kind of that thing that people talk about with Game of Thrones, where it's like, don't get attached to anyone because they're all going to die anyway. It kind of ruins the experience a little bit. So then the question is like, well, why did they do this? Is this just the people at Telltale being bad writers? Is it just them being mean? Is it just them being evil? Well, there's something kind of interesting we've got to think about, which is, if anyone's studying computer science, you might be familiar with the concept of a combinatorial explosion. And basically the idea here is, if I were the writer of Telltale's The Walking Dead or any other sort of game, and I had this grand idea that I was going to make every single choice the player makes matter. Okay, great. I give them a choice between who lives and who dies. Then I give them a choice between two other characters who lives and who dies. And I split those branches into two more branches. And then I do it again. And then I do it again. Suddenly I've got a billion different branches of the story that I have to write, and that I have to all make sense, that I have to make them all check for continuity, and I have to, in most games, I would have to have cutscenes, I have to have animations, I have to have voice acting, and that very, very quickly becomes unwieldy. So for a game like The Walking Dead, which splits itself into 5 sort of chapters, let's say there were 2 of these major decisions in each of those chapters. Okay, so across the game there are maybe 10 of these major chapters. And I said I want every single one of them to have some impact on the ending. I want everyone, based on their choices, to have a unique ending. Well, the result is that I would have to write 2 to the power of 10, which is 1,024 unique endings. Now, is anyone here a writer and wants to write 1,024 different endings? Claws people, you're not excited by that? No one?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Oh. Sure. So I think it's kind of understandable why Telltale did that thing, where instead of letting the game split off into a bunch more branches, they just merged them back into one, even though it sucks for the player. So are there some alternative sort of solutions we could use to this big problem? Well, one of them, this is actually probably the most infamous example of this sort of thing, is Mass Effect. So Mass Effect is a game, it's a trilogy of games, and I can see some nods, yeah. It's a trilogy of games in which you are given actually a huge amount of control over the story. Different characters who hang out with you in your party, this is like an RPG sort of thing, different characters you romance, different characters who die, all have an impact, and not just within the game, but across games. So in Mass Effect 2, the choices you made in Mass Effect 1 often have quite a big impact. And it's great, because you can think of it less like a Walking Dead structure where you have a sort of split and it comes back immediately, but rather, it's almost like you have these quite big setups of branches, these quite big diversions. It's just a lot more complicated sort of chart. Because your game might actually look very different from someone else's game at any one point, because the story is being influenced by your choices. But when they made Mass Effect 3, they had to somehow deliver a satisfying ending to this game. And it was kind of like that thing when Game of Thrones ended, and everyone, I keep bringing up Game of Thrones, when Game of Thrones ended, and everyone was like, oh my god, the ending was terrible, wow, it sucked. And then there were other people who were like, well, there were so many plot lines, how on earth were they supposed to wrap them all up nicely? This is that, but like times 1,000. Because you have, it's not even the same story for every player. So what they did instead was, they basically just, you kind of see it at the tail end of the diagram here, they bunched everyone's choices up, and they gave 3 endings. For every single choice that you made across the entire franchise, 3 endings. And a lot of people did not like that, because they felt that their agency as players and their choice over the story and this wonderful sort of space opera that they had created was completely thrown in their face. Because it didn't matter in the ending overall. Similar sort of thing is done in Life is Strange, which is another game that I'm very fond of. In theory, it's sort of the same thing as those sort of Telltale games, but at the end they give you sort of 2 possible endings. And it's all based on one choice you make at the very end of the game, which is kind of the same thing as in Mass Effect, where it's like, okay, a whole bunch of different stuff could have happened, but instead we're sort of bottlenecking it, branching out to 2 different endings. But the specific choice that they make you make at the end of that game is very tied into the themes of the game. It's very tied into the relationships of the game, and if you've played it, you'll know what I'm talking about. And so it does actually feel like a significant sort of... It's almost like asking you, what is your takeaway from this story you've seen? And so by making that choice, it actually does feel quite meaningful, in my opinion. All right, Undertale. Undertale is a very particular example, because this game is very well known for having basically 3 routes through the entire game that feel like almost 3 completely different games. So, for example, basically the whole concept of the game is it's kind of like Pokemon. You sort of have these random encounters with monsters, but instead of fighting the monsters and you defeat the monster and you move on, instead when you defeat the monster, it dies. And the game treats it like you have killed the monster. So like, some dog came up to you and wanted to fight, you just killed a dog. Great job. And so the game, through the first couple of hours, sort of takes a look at how you're choosing to play it and judges you for it. And this is where it kind of splits you off into 3 different paths, which are known as the neutral, pacifist, and genocide runs, which almost feel like 3 completely different games. So we've got this kind of like couple of branches at the start that then sort of like end up being 3 very straight lines through the rest of the game. So for example, if you commit to the genocide run, most people are going to have the same experience there. There isn't that much, branching that happens from there. So this is a choice as well, but it basically means that you're writing 3 separate games. For them, it was something that, for Toby Fox, it was something he wanted to do, might not be for you. Another interesting thing they do in the neutral path, where you kind of don't really commit to killing all the monsters or saving all of them, is that ending actually has a lot of variations, which some people may not be aware of, but basically what happens in the neutral ending of Undertale is you get a phone call from one of the characters, where he basically gives you like a summary of how every other character in the game is doing now that you're gone. And so basically you use like every single text box is kind of like the state of a different character. But what that means is, every single character could have a couple of different ways they're going. And this is the tree of all the different variations of that conversation that can happen. And there are a lot of branches. There are a lot of different neutral endings you could get. But because they're just text, it's actually not that hard for the writer to make. So they kind of decided to just like grin and bear it with that thing we talked about where you end up with 1,024 different endings. Toby Fox made the decision that, well, I don't have to make animations, I don't have to make cutscenes, I don't have to do that for every single ending, I just have to write text. So I'll just do it. Worked for him. Another solution is the game 80 Days, which is created by a very fantastic company called Inkle. If anyone's ever heard of the script writing language Ink, this was made by them. And they use it in all of their games. If you haven't heard of it, don't worry. But basically, this game does something else that's kind of interesting. This is sort of a chart of what this game looks like. And every single one of these sort of clusters of choices is thought, you can think of it as a different location in the world. Because the premise of this game is it's based on the book Around the World in 80 Days. Basically, at the start of the game, you're like, we made a bet, we're going to get around the world in 80 days. And you can do it in any way you like. You can do it via the North Pole. You can do it via Canada. You can do it via Australia. You can do it via Russia. You can do it via anywhere you like. And in every single place you go, there's like a little self-contained story that occurs. But it also sometimes has impact over here, or impact over here, or anything like that. So if you met someone in, say, Mexico, they could pop up again when you get to Europe. ultimately start and end in the same place. You start in London, and you've got to make your way around the world back to London. So the ending is kind of generic, and it is kind of the same for every player, but it's really about the journey, more so than that. But again, it's this idea of the game is mostly text. In fact, I'll show you a screenshot from it. It's basically just a visual novel. So again, we kind of run into that problem of if you were to just try and do this with cutscenes and animations in 3D, it's kind of a bit unfeasible. But I would assume most of us, if we are making games, are probably not going to be doing that. So why not? Why not go for it? So here are 3 different sort of tree structures. These sorts of charts I've used, which may be a bit confusing, but might be helpful. If you want some more, there are a bunch more at these links. And also the PowerPoint presentation will be available on the club's Discord server for the GMC, so feel free to join that and get all these wonderful links. There's also a GDC talk, which is GDC has like a conference for game developers, and they basically just give like lecture-y sort of things. And this is from the developer of E-Days and those games and how their sort of approach to that sort of thing works. It's very cool. But yeah, so we had that Walking Dead sort of structure where you had these very small branches that come together very quickly because, I save one character but they die 3 hours later anyway. You have Mass Effect where we have these very, very big sort of diversions, very different stories that all sort of bunch up and end up in one of 3 endings. And then we have this 80 days sort of idea where you've got a bunch of different sort of clusters of stories, and it does actually feel like the journey is quite different each time. In fact, it's very, very playable because you'll experience it completely differently each time. Now, of course, if you did want to just sort of like go for it and, just like eat up all the costs it would take to make graphics and 3D whatever and cutscenes, you can look to the David Cage games, such as Detroit Become Human, or its worse behaved, edgier, and more misogynistic older brother, Heavy Rain. And these games are interesting because they actually show you the chart, that like one of these charts that we were just looking at, of how a certain scene could have gone. So let's say you had a hostage situation and it ended in a certain way, like at the start of Detroit Become Human. It tells you, hey look, here are all the different things you could have seen that you haven't. And it's kind of like, oh cool, I want to play again and see that sort of thing happen. And in fact, these games do have a lot of different endings. Your choices do feel like they matter. And it actually, I think it's almost sort of like a best of all the world sort of thing. It's interesting. And then another solution is, I don't know if anyone remembers the game Quantum Break. This was a game that when the Xbox One was released, Microsoft tried very aggressively to market, and it kind of didn't really succeed. In fact, in this edition, you get a full game download of Alan Wake when you buy this game. So it's like, okay, great. They did something very strange in this game. So what they did was, they kind of did it like the Telltale games, where you get these like sort of choice moments, but they split them up a lot. So there's like, you get one choice, and then a couple hours later, you'll get another choice. And it's a very like distinct moment of like, right now, I am making a choice. And in theory, that choice is going to matter. Wow. But then they did something very strange. The result of that choice was this. This is a TV show that they integrated into the game. And so basically the way you guys, this is confused looks, when you play the game, you play the gameplay for a few hours. It's like third-person shooter, pretty generic, nothing really exciting going on there. And then you watch an episode of a TV show. And at the end of that episode, you make a choice. And in theory, that's going to have an impact on the future TV show, the future episodes of the TV shows you watch. It's certainly an option. I'm not going to say necessarily it's a very effective option, especially because it's not exactly a very well-renowned game. That might just be good writing, but it's just weird. And given that we started this talk with all this idea of, oh, here's how you can use games to tell narrative. Well, this is not using games to tell narrative. This is just saying we're going to make a TV show and add some generic third-person shooter combat to it. So I'm not super into this idea. All right, let's take a couple minutes just to chill before we sort of start to get a bit more galaxy brain with it. So yeah, let's just decompress for a few minutes and we'll get back to it.
But too many.
Played any of the David Cage games?
Yes. Like, I love how it is. Yeah. Nice. Yeah, I know. Really good. I don't know if you played it or Well, yeah, no, I didn't see the plot twist coming in that game. It kind of like it made such a big plot that I completely forgot the rest of the game.
Hit it once.
Yeah. No worries. Is that going to screw up the entire the stream? I think I can. Okay. Where am I going? PowerPoint. Where is it?
Committee members.
Members.
Yeah, just
Here.
Copy message.
Copy image.
Copy image.
PowerPoint. At the very end. Ooh. New slide.
And then just you can forget about everything. Literally, just, it doesn't matter. You just copy.
Yeah, that's it.
Hooray! Okay.
Baldur's Gate? No, not yet. It's still on my bucket list. Apparently, that's the best game.
What is that? Oh, I didn't plug back in. Yeah. That's kind of Can you guys check that the stream isn't fast? Yeah.
D&D as a game. It's also very expensive.
Everything good? Sweet. Yeah, they just went for it, apparently. They have a case where they can recruit to the Caribbean. They wrote that that's not. Why would you even think that would be why? They just did it. It's crazy. And I can kill all of the city in the beach and talk without talking to everyone. And just be them responsible. Yeah, that's true. No. I guess we Alrighty, how are we all doing? We ready to go? Alright. We're all happy? Let me know if you want some more time to chill. Otherwise, okay, tough. How are we on that one? Alright, let's get back to it. So, next sort of thing I want to talk about is what is kind of a bit of a buzzword if anyone's sort of hung around narrative design, is this term ludonarrative, which is kind of an interesting term. Ludo meaning game, narrative meaning narrative. Ooh, game narrative, isn't that what we're all here for? But basically, you know at the start when I was talking about that idea of like, how can we use games to do a similar thing to how films use like film shots to create meaning? How can we do the same? Well, ludonarrative is a very interesting concept. It's basically, I like to think of it almost treating games like we treat poetry. So when you read a poem, right, you might look at like, oh wow, they rhymed these words in a certain way. They use this word has a certain connotation. This word like feels nature-y, that sort of thing. And that the very specific qualities of that word are communicating the meaning. Same thing here. Very specific qualities of the gameplay in the game might communicate meaning. So to sort of explain this concept, I want to sort of jump to what is at this point a bit of a meme. This is sort of a very canonical article, blog post in game design, which is entitled "Ludonarrative Dissonance in Bioshock," which has been dunked on a lot over the years, but I think it has some very interesting ideas. So basically, this is talking about the game Bioshock, which the whole point of the first Bioshock game in theory is the exploration of this idea called what they call objectivism, which is sort of this ideology of like, we should act in our own rational self-interest and that's it. And so like, you know, I should be selfish, I should, you know, there's a lot of like themes of like capitalism, that sort of thing. And that's it. And the game is kind of like, well, that's not actually that great. What if there are problems with that way of living your life? I don't know. But the way the game sort of lets you as a player explore that is through this mechanic here. Now, these are called Little Sisters. And the sort of the vibe is there's sort of these like, oh my god, these innocent sort of like little doll-like characters, and you as a player get the choice to sort of find them and either kill them and harvest their like soul to make yourself more powerful, or you can rescue them. And so by doing that, the game is letting you choose through its gameplay how you want to engage with that theme of like being selfish and rationally self-interested. So if you are going to be like really selfish and like kill these little children to make, give yourself more power-ups, you sort of get that idea of, well, you're a bit of a dick, aren't you? But you are engaging with that theme and sort of embracing that ideology that the game's presenting you. Versus if you choose to reject it, you yourself are less powerful as a character, and you're sort of, so I guess you can think of that as rejecting that ideology. However, the game's actual narrative forces you to pick a very specific side. The game's narrative is like, we've got to fight back against this idea. We've got to fight back against the big villain who stands for this idea of being selfish and rationally self-interested. And you as a player don't actually get a choice in that. So then, if you play the game and you decide to play it by killing all the little girls and making yourself really big and powerful, oh, look at me, the game's story is kind of working against you. Because you don't get a choice what side of this sort of theme and this sort of idea you get to sort of explore in a narrative, but you do in the gameplay. And the result is what they termed ludonarrative dissonance. They're saying there's a difference between what the gameplay is telling you and what the story is telling you. And so I think this is kind of interesting. Coming back to sort of like at the start where I was like, okay, what if we think of games and narrative as sort of this possibility space rather than just like a straight line or something, or a tree like for branching narrative. Here it's almost like we have two different narrative spaces. One of them is the story, which is a straight line. It's telling you have to think this is what you should reflect about on this thing. And the gameplay is telling you something different. And so it kind of, the criticism from that article was basically that this kind of ruins games as a medium in a certain sense. And he ended that article with a very interesting line, which I think is pretty evocative. And they said the games do not yet have their Citizen Kane. And that's a movie that is often seen as like one of the greatest films of all time because they do so much with films as a medium. They use film shots in such an interesting way, blah 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 blah. And Bioshock is not doing that for games. So what could we do to do that for games? Well, we should embrace this idea of ludonarrative dissonance and turn it into what is called ludonarrative harmony, where the game's narrative and the gameplay are telling you the same thing, and they're letting you explore things in the same way. Another maybe simpler example is Grand Theft Auto 5, which has 3 protagonists, and I want to talk about 2 of them. This here is Michael. Now, Michael is a Grand Theft Auto protagonist, which means that his pastimes are mass murdering innocent civilians, stealing cars, and blowing shit up. But the narrative kind of like, in fact, the first thing we get of him is kind of like, oh, my family doesn't like me very much. Oh no, I'm so sad. I'm in therapy, but also I don't like my therapist. I'm like this big macho guy. But again, it's sort of this idea of like, well, the narrative is like, oh, he's kind of depressed, but the gameplay is like, dude, you're murdering people. Like, that's what are we doing here? As opposed to the other character, Trevor, whose whole thing is about, yeah, I'm a mass murdering psychopath. I puff gasoline and do all sorts of weird crap. And I think it actually works slightly better because the gameplay is lined up with the narrative. The narrative is saying, I'm a guy who blows shit up for fun and eats people, and the gameplay is doing the same thing. Minus the eating people, maybe. But the result is actually, I feel like of the two, I actually kind of like Michael more as a character. And if you play Grand Theft Auto 5, maybe you feel the same way, maybe you don't. Because if you debase a character and their sole trait is I'm a mass murdering psychopath, it kind of restricts the ability to which you're able to write that character. And I think as a result, Trevor ends up being quite shallow. Because there's not much they can do with that, the writers can do with it, if that's all they have to go off of. Another example from the series that I think does this much better is Nico from Grand Theft Auto 4. Now, this game, this protagonist is sort of very informed, and his sort of backstory is like this war trauma from when he lived in Serbia and was like smuggling people post-war. It's a bit stereotypical, but like it informs his character. And in this scene, he's basically talking about like, oh no, I did bad things in the war, and so after the war, I didn't really care about doing bad things, and it didn't mean anything to me. So that actually, the kind of amoral, very cynical view of the world does actually line up quite well with, again, similar gameplay as the other game, going around and killing people all the time. This other character asks him, and don't you worry about your soul? And his response is basically, no, fuck off. Because, again, he is an amoral character. So for the gameplay to be amoral, it lines up quite nicely. The gameplay and the narrative are telling you the same thing. Interesting thing, though, is that this is a cutscene, and it's kind of giving us the key thing to the game. And I know I was just saying before, oh, shouldn't the gameplay be giving the key things to the game? But this is a cutscene. It's got text, all like a book. It's got dialogue, all like a movie. It's got, props and stuff. There's all sorts of stuff. And that's kind of what cutscenes are, right? A lot of the time when we make a cutscene, cutscene in the game that's kind of just like, okay, let's take away the gameplay, let's almost treat it like a TV show for a sec, but it can be quite effective. Because just because we are games doesn't mean we can only use gameplay to tell our stories. We can use text. We can use all the stuff that films do. We can use all that stuff we talked about right at the start and use it as long as they're all going in the same direction. And I think that's how we create a sort of narrative harmony as opposed to Bioshock. Sometimes games will try and do this sort of thing on like a raw mechanical level, like literally in terms of the buttons you're pressing on the screen. On the controller. And a very common sort of trope of this is there's a bit of a meme at this point, but like in games like Until Dawn, the mash X to not die sort of thing. If you ever played one of these games, it's like, okay, I'm being chased by some sort of monster, and now I'm hiding in a closet. And I don't want the monster to come get me, so I have to press these buttons to like hold the door closed so that and if I fail the quick time event, it's going to come and eat me. Or in Until Dawn in particular, they do this thing where it's like they use the motion controls in the PlayStation 4 controller, and they give this prompt on the screen. It's like, don't breathe. And so if you move the PlayStation 4 controller, it goes like, oh, the monster can hear you breathing and it rips you out and it kills you. And it's kind of interesting because the idea is by making you do these really quick sort of like rapid button presses, it makes you feel, in theory, that tension that the characters are feeling. And it makes you feel scared or whatever, or at least it gets your heart rate up in some sort of way. And the result is, I guess, that sort of unity of player and character that we really are looking for. Of course, sometimes this fails absolutely miserably. Here's an example from... or not. Yeah, you know what I'm doing here.
Miroslav Korda?
No, shut up.
Yeah.
Okay, we're not watching that one. Basically, what happens in that is it's this like intense chase scene where you're chasing some guy who you think murdered your son or something, and the game is like, oh my god, we're trying to make the character feel that tension. Here's a quick time event where you've got to jump over these grocery things, but if you just fail the quick time event, you just like flop into a table. And it's like, okay, he's throwing ice everywhere, and it's a quick time event, so you don't slip on the ice. And if you fail the quick time event, you just go, ah, and it's really goofy. It's ridiculous. It completely breaks the tone of the game. It completely breaks the seriousness. It completely breaks the tension. It's completely absurd. But in theory, that sort of thing can be used for good effect. The Wii is actually a pretty good example of this. Tons of Wii games, and this was the gimmick when the Wii came out, was, oh, we're going to use the Wii remote to make the player feel what they're doing. See, when you play like Wii Sports, for example, I feel like I'm playing tennis. I feel like I'm playing baseball. Even like Zelda Skyward Sword was doing this thing where the controller is basically like the sword. So when I attack a monster with my sword, I'm swinging at them. You look like a moron while you're doing it. But again, you feel what the character's feeling. You physically are doing the action. And so it brings you as a player sort of in tune with the gameplay. Another very typical sort of thing, we kind of have the meme at this point of like, oh, like with the Batman Arkham games. This game really makes you feel like Batman. This game really makes you feel like Spider-Man in the new Spider-Man games. What do they actually mean by that? What do you mean, feel like Batman? Well, I guess the idea is that the way that you're interacting with that game, the way that like the fighting mechanics works, the way that the movement works, it sort of lines up with what we, from watching movies and reading comics and stuff, would expect Batman to feel like. So the fact that I can jump all over things and leap down on enemies and that sort of thing feels like Batman, because that's what I expect Batman to be. It's kind of interesting. Another sort of bit more generic example is like in like water levels in games or games that are set in water. They tend to have very fluid controls. So it gives you the idea of just like sort of swimming, just gliding through the water, as opposed to sort of more rigid controls. So often you'll be like doing it on a joystick, so you can sort of get that sort of circular sort of motion compared to like 1, 2, 3, 4, pick an axis and stick with it. So we as narrative designers can sort of play with that if we like. We just have to be a bit more assertive in how we work with game designers and programmers and all of them. All right. Very good example of putting all this in practice is Papers, Please. Absolutely fantastic game if you somehow are not aware of it. What this game is it's set, you are a border control guard in this sort of hypothetical sort of pseudo like East German sort of country. And it's your job to scan through everyone's documentation and either let them into the country or reject them. But the result is people are going to try and give you dodgy documentation. And people are going to be like, no, please, I know I don't have a passport, but let me in, because if you don't let me in, my husband's going to be mad at me or something. That sort of thing. And it's very, very chaotic gameplay. People will have like 5 different documents and you just get every single detail of the document with every single other detail of everything. It's really, really stressful as a player. But that's intentional because it makes you feel what the character is feeling, which is this stress of being in this very sort of like politically charged situation, of having to make life or death decisions about should I let this person in if they're going to be killed if I turn them away, even though they don't have a passport. There's like bombings at the border checkpoint all the time, and it is sort of the political tension building up. So by giving us that intensity and that nervousness as a player, we feel the intensity and nervousness of the situation. Another game that does a similar thing is Florence, which was actually made in Melbourne. I don't know if it's made in Australia, it's made in Australia. And this game has no dialogue or sound effect, but it tells its story of a young couple entirely through these sort of little mini-game sort of things. So you control how she brushes her teeth, or you choose which emojis to send in a text message to her boyfriend, or you're making food together. And by doing that, and by feeling the way that those mechanics work, you figure out how she's feeling. You figure out that she's feeling nervous by the way she brushes her teeth. Maybe, I don't know, you're brushing the teeth, but suddenly, like, a movement happens that you didn't actually press the button for. And so you go, oh, maybe she's, like, not sort of fully in control of her actions or something like that. Now, you can also do the opposite of this. We've just talked about games which intentionally put their gameplay and their story together. You can actually intentionally put your gameplay and your story apart. And a very, very good example of this is the game Spec Ops: The Line. Now, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this game. Very, very good. So what it is it's basically, take like Call of Duty, right? Where you're going around and you're like, okay, we've got to go to this random country and shoot these people who are like bad guys or whatever. Most of the time it's like stereotypical foreigner character. Oh, okay, great. And it's sort of like, I think it's kind of propagandistic. This game takes that and turns it on its head. You are a character who works for the US military, and you have been deployed to Iraq, and it's the same thing as usual like an FPS game. It's pretty standard FPS gameplay. You go around and you shoot, generic enemy people. You do this, you do that. It's like we're blowing stuff up. Oh my god, great. But then the game does something very interesting. Because like in any FPS game, you kind of get that thing where it's like, okay, something moves over there, let's shoot it. What happens if we take that and we turn that into just an innocent civilian? Well, now that person moves, you shoot them, and oh shit, you just shot a civilian. And then it does it again, and again, and again. And it has a very, very famous scene in this game where you basically bomb a village of just completely defenseless people with white phosphorus, and they just like burn to death. And it's incredibly gruesome, it's incredibly graphic, and it's incredibly disturbing. But the idea here is we're taking a gameplay that's all about, oh my god, look at you, you're such a hero, wow, action, movie style, whatever, and taking the very real consequences of that, which is you are committing, mass murder. And it sort of makes you reflect. And so the games like GUI will, like, on the loading screen, will give you stuff like, feel like a hero yet, that sort of thing. The game is almost mocking you for engaging with this sort of generic FPS gameplay on its own level. And it's very, very interesting, because the gameplay and the narrative are telling you 2 very different things in an intentional manner. What about a game like Crazy Taxi? Crazy Taxi, I would not argue if you've played it. I don't think it has much of a narrative. But basically, you're a taxi driver and you've got to do as many taxi fares in a very limited amount of time, as much as possible. And the result is, well, I only have 90 seconds and I need to deliver a bunch of taxi fares, so I'm going to do something. I'm going to drive as quickly as possible. I'm going to drive dangerously. I'm going to drive in a crazy manner. But if there were not this timer here, what's stopping you from sort of just like, I'm going to stop at every red light, I'm going to sort of obey the speed limit, I'm going to sort of, I might stop the car and say hi to someone, that sort of thing, right? That's not what happens in the game because of this speed limit. Because of this time limit. This gameplay element here has narrative implications. It makes it feel frenzied. It makes it feel, oh my god, I gotta do this flip, oh my god, I gotta get there as quickly as possible. And you feel energized. It's very arcadey. And that's a result of a specific game mechanic because of gameplay. And so this is where there's very much sort of an overlap between narrative design and game design. And I know most people who are writers for games probably try not to work too much with that, but I'd encourage you to try. So, question is, can we do something like that in a systematic way? So that we don't have to, design the entire game ourselves? Yes, you can. So Left 4 Dead is a game developed by Valve. They introduced this idea called a director system, which is very interesting. Basically what a director system is it sort of keeps track of this idea of the tension in the level. I haven't played the game, it's basically like a co-op zombie survival sort of thing. And so basically the game has this sort of director thing, computer-controlled thing, that will decide when it wants to spawn new enemies and when it wants to not spawn new enemies. And it does it intentionally to control the tension. So by spawning a bunch of new enemies at once, it sort of makes you feel more scared as a player. Oh my god, no, I'm stressed. Oh my god, I gotta yell at my friend to come get this med kit or whatever, that sort of thing. And the game does that intentionally to ramp up the tension, and then it'll let you suffer with that for a bit, and then it'll hold off. It will stop spawning enemies for a while and give you the chance to sort of breathe. And it's doing it in a procedural manner. So you could almost think about this like a very typical sort of narrative arc thing, right? You know, this whole like, oh, you know, you should have a beginning, middle, end, you should have rising action, you should have falling action, you should have a climax, whatever the hell, right? Very typical writing advice. You can do that through the program. So you can have, and in this game it does, it says, okay, at the start we want to make sure the player feels a bit of tension, then more tension, more tension, and build up to this big finale where there are zombies everywhere and you're fighting them, whatever. And so that's, I think, quite cool. Because it lets us directly influence the gameplay in a systematic way to reinforce whatever we want to. It doesn't just have to be tension at a level. It can be anything you like, really. You can use it to reinforce the themes of the game. So, for example, I don't know, let's say I was making a game about, like, the cost of living or something, and I wanted to make the player really feel that stress of, you know, like having to save money. Well, what I could do is, I could use a system like that. So, to, like, maybe change the price of groceries. So, like, okay, I'm going to make the grocery prices go up all of a sudden. Suddenly the players going to become really stressed because they can't afford groceries. And then I'll let them chill for a bit. And then back up, and then chill. And you sort of create that pacing in a systematic way. You could do it with like the speed of dialogue. So let's say you're talking to a character, and their text box is coming up. You can change how fast the speed is coming based on maybe how stressed they are, or how stressful the situation is. But then have it be slower, so that they're sort of a bit more chill. That sort of thing. You could use it for the weather if you wanted to be like, okay, this is a sad part of the game, so we want it to rain a lot because it's a metaphor or whatever. You can do that. Pretty much any variable you can think of, you could do this. As long as you can turn it into a number and set the system up to make that number go up sometimes and down other times. Pretty effective. Alright. Now it's time to get a little bit more complicated. I want to introduce a concept called storylets. Now, in order to do that, I want to talk about the greatest GDC talk of all time, in my opinion, which is a wonderful name that really sort of rolls off the tongue. It's called AI-driven dynamic dialogue through fuzzy pattern matching. Say that 5 times fast. Obviously, AI, I don't mean like ChatGPT, right? But this is also Left 4 Dead. This is basically a dude from Valve delivered this talk about how they made the dialogue in that game work. And this is kind of the key for us to get truly galaxy-brained with how we construct our narratives. Basically, the concept is, take every single line of dialogue in your game. Take it out of its context. Sure, it could be said by this character at this time, whatever, I don't care. Take it out of its context. Put it in a bucket. Chuck every line of dialogue in the game into this bucket, and then come up with some rules about when you can pull that line of dialogue out of the bucket, and then just let the computer go wild and see what happens. What does that look like? Well, this is the basic example we use. We've got 2 robots sort of in a room in a warehouse, and they've got this sort of bucket of dialogue options. They've got 4 dialogue options here, sort of rows of a spreadsheet, and each of them has specific rules about when they can be said. But it doesn't actually tell those robots when they can say things specifically. It just kind of lets them do it. So, the system might say, okay, robot, say a line of dialogue. It doesn't tell you which line of dialogue. It just says, hey, say a line of dialogue. And so it looks in the bucket for, okay, what line of dialogue am I allowed to say right now? So maybe you just rocked up in the room. And so here we're sort of tracking this concept of like, how many barrels have you seen in the room? So when you first spawn, maybe you haven't seen any barrels. So you go, okay, this is a line I'm allowed to say. And maybe it's like, oh my god, it's a barrel. Look at that barrel. Okay. Now, a couple seconds later, we tell the robot, hey, say another line of dialogue. And it checks, okay, well, what are some lines of dialogue I'm allowed to say right now? Well, I've already seen a barrel. So maybe I'll say this line of dialogue. Oh, look, another barrel. And then it's like, okay, well, now I'm going to maybe set a variable that sort of tracks, hey, I've seen like 2 barrels now. Then if I tell it, hey, say a line of dialogue, again, very generic. It's not saying say this line of dialogue, it's just saying, hey, say a line of dialogue. It reaches into the bucket until it finds what it's allowed to say, which is, oh, really, another barrel? A bit ridiculous, getting a bit excessive. And then maybe it sees a bottle instead. So we say, hey, you see a bottle. Say a line of dialogue related to seeing a bottle, and it goes, oh, look, a bottle. Wow. So that's a pretty dumb example, but here's another one that I wrote a couple years ago. And so the concept here is, important thing here is this idea of context, which is kind of like, okay, sometimes it's a bit unwieldy to just say, hey, say a line of dialogue, and it's like every single line of dialogue in a 10-hour game, right? That's a lot of lines of dialogue. But I could instead sort of narrow it down a little bit, and almost create a couple of different buckets. So I say, hey, say your team goes in there, and I just need you to say something generic. All right, you've got a bucket for saying something generic. So in this case, if I said, hey, you're idling right now, you're just sort of sitting there, I need you to just fill in space. You know, like in Red Dead Redemption, when you're sort of just like on the horse, and the characters are just sort of talking to fill in time. That sort of thing. Okay, so say a line of dialogue in that context. All right, now it reaches into the bucket. It says, okay, what lines of dialogue am I allowed to say right now? And it has these rules about which line of dialogue it's allowed to say. So it says, okay, am I happy or am I not happy at the moment? Let's say I am happy. Okay, so now I'm allowed to say that line of dialogue. So it says, okay, I am happy. Or in this case, I've just randomized it to say either I'm happy or yay or something like that. It's not very deep. And then it's going to sort of do something to tick a variable in the broader world space. Very simple stuff, very simple state tracking. Basically, in this case, it's just saying, hey, everyone around me, I'm going to give you I'm going to tell you, look in your bucket that's related to someone else around you being happy and say a line of dialogue. Okay, so maybe that other character's going to look in their buckets. They're going to say, okay, well, when someone's happy, this is my bucket for when someone's happy. Okay, these are my options. These are the lines of dialogue in that bucket. All right, I'm unhappy right now, so I'm allowed to say this one. I'm going to say this. So now, just to recap, we've got one character saying, wow, look how happy I am. And this other character saying, well, I'm not. And that's going to prompt someone else for a reaction. That's maybe related to their bucket of lines to say when someone else is unhappy. So, okay, that person's going, okay, someone else is unhappy. Oh, maybe I'm unhappy too. Well, I'm not happy either. So now, there's no explicit, it's not like that tree we looked at earlier. There aren't rules around this line of dialogue leads to this line of dialogue leads to this line of dialogue. But we've kind of got a conversation happening. Oh my god, I'm so happy. Well, I'm not happy, and I'm not happy either. They're sort of just playing off each other in a very natural way, and this is a pretty ridiculous example, but you can imagine if these buckets were, had a lot more lines of dialogue in them, and maybe they were a bit actually of substance, you could get a pretty interesting conversation happening. And basically the way that they conceptualized it in this talk was the idea of basically self-branching conversation. So instead of writing a dialogue tree, you just write a bunch of lines of dialogue. You tell them, okay, here's when you're allowed to say this line of dialogue, here's when you're not, and just go wild. And it's really interesting. So in that particular game, they have lines of dialogue for when a certain character has been shot. Oh, I need help, oh, I'm injured, oh, give me a medkit, whatever, blah, 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 blah. It's all context-based. And they all play off each other in a way that makes sense every time because of those rules. All you need is some context, so that's which bucket, some rules, okay, I can say this line when I'm bleeding. Doesn't really make sense when I'm not bleeding. If I'm not bleeding, I suddenly say, oh, I'm bleeding, someone give me some bandages. Doesn't really make sense. So I'm going to be required to be bleeding to say that line. And then it's got the actual execution, which is line dialogue, and some sort of effect, which is, like before, prompting someone else to say something in response. Get a bunch of them, chuck them in a bucket, that's all you got to do. But this is intentionally vague. This does not have to be a line of dialogue. So in this particular case, it was a line of dialogue, but it could not be. It could be anything. It could be a cutscene. It could be a chunk of gameplay. It could be a mission. It could be literally anything. The game Reigns is a very interesting example of this, and this is where I will plug the GMC Mega Quest, is that what it's called? In a couple of weeks' time, where it's basically a book club for games. This is the game we're playing at the moment. It's called Reigns. It's on sale for $1.50 on Steam in the sale. Get it, play it. Come along, tell us your thoughts. But this game runs on this sort of architecture. What the game is it sort of like bills itself as like, it's almost like Tinder, but you're the king. And it's like, okay, I'm the king, and all these people are going to come talk to me. This scientist is going to come say, hey, I need money for my research. This dog is going to come say, hey, come follow me. The devil is going to come and say, hey, you should do devil things. This sort of things. People are going to come at me, and I can sort of swipe left or swipe right to accept their demands or not. The game's really interesting because it sets this up as a deck of cards. I think it's a really interesting way of understanding the concept of, again, the term is storylets. So before I said chuck all your dialogue in a bucket, you could also think of it as chucking a bunch of cards in a bag, fishing around for a card, seeing can I use this one or not, and that's what this game literally does. So, it basically, for example, here it's like, okay, the dog is like, hey, come follow the dog, and that's going to set up this sort of gameplay sequence of this series of dialogue where you're like talking to a dog, and then the dog's like, hey, look, I led you to some bandits, I'm going to kill you, good job. That sort of thing. So what does that require? What are the rules we need? Just like before, some lines of dialogue only make sense when I've been shot. What's the example here? Well, in this case, I kind of need a dog for my dog to come say, hey, come do this. If this scientist is like, hey, I need money for my science, well, I kind of need money. If this guy's saying, hey, we need more like security in the prison, and all the prisoners are getting out, so you should put more guards there. Well, that kind of requires me having some money, and it kind of requires me having some prisoners. If either of those is not met, it doesn't really make sense. So let's say, currently, I have money, I have prisoners. And I say, okay, hey game, give me some content that is going to happen now. Just like before I said, hey robot, say a line of dialogue. Okay, game sort of reaches into its deck of cards and it goes, okay, what's one that makes sense? Well, it says this one makes sense. You have money, you have prisoners. And it also says, hey, this one makes sense, you have money. This guy can pay you money, that makes sense. Okay, well what now? We've got two possible cards that could both work. We could both set those sort of sequences in motion. Well, a couple different ways we could play this. In the Left 4 Dead example, they sort of run this idea of the best line is going to be the one that's most context specific. So basically the one that's like ticking the most boxes, that's satisfying the most rules. So in this case, the fact that you need both money and prisoners for this to happen probably means that if you have both money and prisoners, that's going to make kind of more sense in context in this one. That's how they use it, but you don't have to do it that way. So in this case, Left 4 Dead would play this one. Ratings is something else. Sorry, I've written it here as a score. So the score is kind of how many of these prerequisites have been hit. So here, one of them's been hit, so we give it a score of 1, and here, 2 of them have been hit, so we give them a score of 2. So Left 4 Dead will basically do that. Which one has the highest score? Okay, let's do that. Range is something interesting. It takes that, and again, that idea of cards, it basically says, okay, this one's got a score of 1, so we're going to give it 1 card. This one's got a score of 2, we're going to give it 2 cards. We're going to shuffle those cards up, pick one at random, and that's the one we're going to play. So, even though this one's kind of more specific to the context, you could get this one. You could get this one. And the result is, it feels quite random when you're playing. It feels a bit all over the place. And that's kind of the point. Because the game is sort of trying to make it feel very zany and sort of all over the place to be king, and everyone wants you at different times, and it's weird. But Left 4 Dead maybe wanted their systems to be a bit more predictable, so they didn't lean into the randomness here. They just said, which one has the highest score, let's go with that. Either works. I like to think of it as sort of a winners takes all versus just like shuffle it up approach. Okay. Alright, what are some other games that use this? Some people have made ADKs before, and I also mentioned they made that software Inc. We will talk a little bit about that later. They also made the game Heaven's Vault, which is a detective sort of game, but it's semi sort of open world, and so like based on where you are in the game, you could find different clues at different times, and different sort of cases could appear at different times. And so they use this sort of system to go, what makes sense in this context? What should this character say based on all the different clues you know versus all the ones you don't know, etc. Hades has a lot of dialogue, and it's very well renowned for its dialogue, and it's like a novel's worth of dialogue. It uses this system to sort of train it. Just like Left 4 Dead. It says, which line of dialogue makes sense in this context, that's what we use. Firewatch does the same. So in terms of the, if you play that game, you're sort of on the walkie-talkie to like the supervisor while you're wandering around the national park, and the supervisor is going to say certain things based on context. So it's kind of a systematic way of doing that choice and consequence stuff from before. So she might remember something you said 5 hours ago, and use that as part of her context rule for, well, if you said something about how you hate dogs 5 hours ago, I'm going to say this line that's specific to you hating dogs. Something like that. It's interesting. I like to think of it almost like you take that tree structure we talked about earlier, and you sort of cut off all the branches, and just sort of deconstruct that tree, again, put it in a bucket and see what happens. Really interesting. If you're interested in this, because it really, the applications of it are extremely broad, there's a lot of potential. This is your like sort of God-given amazing link. Emily Short has done a huge amount of research on this, has made a bunch of sort of games, and has a huge amount of really interesting blog posts on the theory behind this sort of design. So check that out. Alright, let's talk about NPCs. I sort of teased at the start of this talk that I'm particularly interested in NPC design. How does that come in? This is basically just me going to be yapping about my own special interests. That's fine, don't worry. Alright, so NPCs. Like our lovely guy from Oblivion here. Oblivion's an interesting example. Has anyone ever heard of the Radiant AI system from the Elder Scrolls Oblivion? I would assume not, it's kind of niche. Basically, if you have played Oblivion, It's quite infamous for having NPCs that are a bit weird. Not only in their lines of dialogue and the way that they, they kept like outtakes from the dialogue in the game, but also just like the behavioural structure. It wasn't always like that. At one point in development, the NPCs, they basically gave them sentience. What I mean by that is, it was a system they called Radiant AI, where they basically gave the NPC the ability to say, okay, I'm a drug addict. So what does that mean? Well, that means I really need drugs. In the game, it's like they call it skooma. So I really want skooma. Okay, I'm going to do whatever I can to get skooma. What does that look like? Well, there's a skooma dealer over there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kill him, steal his skooma, and then kill anyone else who also wants skooma so I can steal their skooma. And then that's part of my daily ritual. And so you just walk in the game, and you just see people just randomly killing each other, and robbing each other, and doing random stuff. And it was absolutely ridiculous. But it was kind of the result of giving the NPCs sort of too much ability to make their own stories. And it would end up with like people with like main characters or essentials of the main quest would just be killed by some random NPC who wanted to rob them or something. It was very silly. So they ended up having to sort of take it out of the game. Alright. But this sort of approach, while it was very risky in that game, it didn't work out and it took it out, it has been tried in some other games. So if anyone here is familiar with the YouTube channel Game Maker's Toolkit, you will probably be familiar with this game, which is Shadow of Mordor. Now, Shadow of Mordor is a very interesting game because it's sort of like, on its surface, sort of your traditional sort of like RPG type thing, fantasy RPG. Okay, I go around, I kill some monsters, and I fight the big boss. But it kind of gives the NPCs personality. So if I kill a monster, there's a chance that that monster actually survives. And then half an hour later, I'm raiding up like an orc camp, and that orc comes up and says, "Oi, mate!" And he's got like stitches in his arms. Like, "You chopped my arms off, but I put them back on, and I remember you, and we're gonna fight. I'm gonna avenge myself." That sort of thing. If you run away from an enemy, for example, you might bump into them 3 hours later. They go, "Oh, I know you ran away, you coward!" And so by doing that, by sort of tracking your interactions with every monster in the game, it kind of creates these sort of self-enclosed stories. Like we said way back at the start, kind of like in Civilization where you sort of have those head-canon sort of stories. Here they're doing it with just random monsters in the world. And it's really quite effective. And they even have like their own little hierarchies of like, okay, this one's the big boss. And he is like mean to all the little mini bosses, and they're like his underlings and all this sort of thing. And sometimes they're going to scheme to like, well, I want to become the next big boss, so I'm going to kill the big boss and become the big boss. It's a whole thing. Unfortunately, it's patented. That's the whole thing. Whatever. Okay. So Shadow of Mordor, very interesting example of how we can use NPCs to tell stories. Shadow of Mordor was developed by Monolith Productions, which recently shut down. And if you are, like me, into NPC design at all, you should know exactly what I'm about to say. There is another game that's created by Monolith Productions, and that is Fear, which is kind of a game that's, on the surface, if we look at this, it's like, oh, okay, great. Kind of around shooting some soldier dudes, great. And it's like, oh, it's like, just did that thing that's like the mid-2000s where every game was trying to do like, ooh, kind of like psychological, like, oh, monstery sort of stuff, supernatural. So it's like, oh, they just ripped off the ring, and we're going to chuck a little girl in there who looks a bit scary, and we're going to chuck jump scares every so often. Ooh, it's a horror first-person shooter, that's great. But, game is something very unique. And that's in the NPCs. The NPCs run on what is essentially kind of the holy grail of NPC AI design, which is called goal-oriented action planning, or GOAT for short. So if anyone has ever played with like programming NPCs before, you might be familiar with like a finite state machine or a behavior tree or something like that. If you're not, don't worry at all. This is like that on steroids. What it is, and shout if you see any similarities with what we've already talked about. Here basically, we have a bunch of different actions that the monster can perform. And instead of like in a traditional game where we tell, okay, if you see the player, you've got to shoot them. If you are hungry, you've got to go eat something, whatever. Here it basically says, here are all the things you could do as a monster. You could shoot the player. You could reload your gun. You could eat a sandwich. Now, not all of those are going to make sense in every situation, right? If I'm some sort of soldier, I'm going around patrolling, and I want to kill the player, it probably doesn't make sense for me to just suddenly eat a sandwich, right? But again, just like before with our storylet system, we have this idea of, okay, well then what makes sense in each circumstance? If I eat a sandwich, well, that doesn't really make sense if A, I'm eating a sandwich, and B, I'm hungry. Could add to that. C, I'm not being shot at. That's pretty important. If I'm going to reload a gun, what do I need to reload a gun? When would it make sense to reload my gun? Well, I need to have a gun. Maybe I run out of bullets, something like that. I'm going to shoot the player. What does that require? Well, it requires me having a gun, and it requires that gun being loaded. All these different rules. Again, it's this idea of what makes sense in context. Now, you might wonder, what the hell does this have to do with telling stories? Well, it's a very similar sort of architecture to what we had with our sort of cards, and we chuck them in a bag and we ask which ones made sense. And in fact, what people say about these NPCs in this game is that they feel like some of the smartest NPCs in any game, even though this is from like 2007. Because by combining all of these systematic rules, just like our cards in a bag, you get some really quite interesting and creative behavior. So let's say you're like, I don't know, I'm hanging out over here and someone's over there. That NPC might decide, I'm going to flip a table, hide for cover, and start shooting at you from behind it. And it ends up with very dynamic, expressive gameplay that maybe the designers didn't intend. I keep making comparisons between that and our sort of story system, because what if we could use a similar system to create dynamic and expressive stories that we didn't necessarily see coming? What do I mean by that? Well, the way that this is actually achieved, the G in Go, stands for goal. What they do is, in order to give some order to what actions the NPC is going to take at any one time, they basically tell it, here's a goal state that we want you to work towards. We want you to work towards the player being dead. Okay, so it says, this is a little bit different from before we just shoved our hand into a bag, saw what worked. Here we're saying, no, you're not just going for what actions can I perform, you're going for what actions should you perform. You should be working towards the player being dead. Okay, so look at my options and I go, which one's going to make the player dead? Shooting the player. Okay, great, so I'm going to shoot the player. Can I shoot the player? If I can, sure, do it. If I can't, because I need my gun to be loaded, well then in that case I'm going to reload my gun. Maybe I don't have a gun, because I need a gun to be able to reload a gun. Okay, well then I'll go find a gun. And it sort of works backwards from this goal to figure out what it needs to do to make it happen. And it ends up with what we call a plan, where it goes, first step, reload a gun. Second step, shoot the player. Third step, player is dead. Fourth step, profit. Right. Goal achieved. Okay. But again, it's exactly the same as our storylines. It even has the scoring thing we talked about before, where we're like, okay, maybe this card's better than this other card because it's more specific. Here they do the same thing. Maybe like eating a sandwich is easier for them to do than going and making a big meal. So they might pick which is going to be the easiest one to do. Which one, instead of like a score, and like which one has the highest score, in this case, often we think about it in terms of cost. And we're trying to lower the cost. That's really the same thing. It's harder for me to make a banquet. It's easier for me to eat a sandwich. I'm just going to eat a sandwich. Great. If anyone has studied computer science before, or algorithms, you might be familiar with the A-star algorithm, which is often used for like navigation NPCs. Again, I promise we'll come back to narrative in a second. But basically the key idea here is how can I get from point A to point B and move around obstacles? So I might say, okay, why does it make more sense for me to go like this, rather than go the scenic route and go like this? And the reality is because this is a longer route. And so, just like before, we had this idea of what costs more to do. Here they're saying, well, it costs more for me to go here because it'll take longer, it's harder, I'll get tired, whatever. Same thing. So, you might have many different ways you can accomplish the payment here. What's the easiest way? What's the way that takes the least effort? What's the way that takes the least time? Something like that. What's the one that requires me doing less little tiny steps along the way? That is GOPE. But it can apply exactly to our storyline system. Because just like our storylines, just like our little cards, every card has things that need to happen before we can do it. And every card has impacts upon the world. Just like shooting the player has requirements, and it has impacts, which is I've shot the player. Same thing. So what if we applied the same algorithm? What if we applied the A-star algorithm, and we said, okay, let's say I'm some peasant, and I want to become king. I have a bag of cards and things I could do in the world. I could go and open a shop. I could go and fight some monsters. I could go and stab the king in the face. I could go and become his right-hand man and then stab the king in the face. Ooh, that would work, wouldn't it? That would achieve my goal of becoming king. Let's do that. And so it's kind of this idea of giving a brain and giving some sort of method to the madness of which cards am I pulling out, which ones am I doing. We go from which cards can I play to which cards should I play. And that has incredible potential. So, You could have, any character in your game go, okay, my goal as Mario is to save the princess. What are some things I can do? I can jump on some Goombas, I can go forward and fight Bowser, I can do this, I can do that, I can do that. Some of those things are going to solve the problem. Some of them are going to be like collecting coins and then just chilling and sitting on a pile of coins. That doesn't actually solve my goal of saving the princess, so I probably won't go for that. If we don't give the Mario this goal-oriented action playing, I like to think of it as giving us a brain, then you might just go, okay, well, what's available to me as an option? Oh, doing coins is pretty easy, so I'm going to go collect coins and sit on coins. That doesn't help him save the princess. If we tell him, your goal is to save the princess and you need to be doing as much as you can to save the princess, he's not going to do that. He's going to sort of self-sort this card's irrelevant. Instead, I'm going to the final boss, I'm fighting Bowser and saving the princess. And he's deciding to do that all by himself. We as narrative designers do not have to tell him that that is how you save the princess. He will do it himself. What if we had multiple characters, all with their own goals, and all with their own brains? What if we had a whole bunch of peasants that were trying to become king? And they were all sort of attacking him in slightly different ways. And we ended up with this really fun sort of contest between the peasants of which one's going to become the king. It's totally possible. What if we gave them all different sets of cards? Because let's say we had a peasant who can only do a certain number of things, but instead we had a knight who maybe has actions available to him that the peasant doesn't. A knight, can, arrange a marriage with himself or whatever. That could, somehow get him towards becoming king in a different way than the peasant. So he's got more options. And what if we gave them all brains and let them go at it? Who's going to win? Who knows? We could also give them different goals. One of them could want to become peasant, one of them could just want to find a husband or something. Anything. The point is, we're giving characters goals, and we're giving them an expressive way to do it. And that's very powerful. Okay. What if we introduced a director system? And we let that director system, at different points of time, change the cost of certain cards, and make certain actions easier than others. What if we said maybe a certain theme in your game was I want people to get more violent by the end of it. Because I want it to get more chaotic, and I want it to get scarier, maybe I want it to be a horror game or something. Then maybe, as time goes on, I'm going to use that director system, remember it's all about this chart, to make maybe more violent actions less difficult to do. What if I want to encourage, I give the characters an incentive to go for more violent actions as the game goes on? And so the result is they start off quite peaceful, but by the end of the game, they're just stabbing each other left, right, and center. You can totally do that. The possibilities are endless. You could do it for maybe I'm going to be more romantic by the end of the game. Maybe if you were Bioshock, maybe I want to be more selfish and self-interested by the end of the game. Whatever you want, and you can change it and ebb and flow it over time. The possibilities are really endless. All right. So, let's take stock. Where are we at? What have we done? Here are some of the methods we've discussed this evening. Finally, we talked about environmental and emergent storytelling, which is, again, that idea of just like systems, so like civilization, like The Sims, this headcanon sort of thing. And environmental storytelling, which is like props. Good. We talked about linear narrative, which, again, I made that argument that, hey, if you're just going to have mission, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's possibly a little bit playing it safe. Hopefully I've somewhat convinced you on that point. Maybe I haven't. Again, nothing wrong with linear narrative. Branching narrative and the many sub-forms of it. The Walking Dead versus 80 Days. Very different games. What is branching narratives? We've talked about lunar narrative and how you can make sure that the gameplay really lines up with your narrative goals and story and the themes you're trying to tell. We've talked about director systems and how we as narrative designers can exert direct control over how the gameplay feels and sort of shape the lunar narrative to our needs. My thing has gone off onto a different thing. We have also talked about storylets. Again, cards. How can we use disconnected chunks of narrative? We chop the decision tree into a bunch of different pieces. We chop the leaves up, we put them in a bag, and we see what happens. Then we gave that system we gave it sentience. We said, okay, how can we use like a planning algorithm to sort of order those storylets, order those cards in a way that's intelligent, and see it's just the characters working towards a goal rather than just doing shit that's in front of them. And then we talked about combining all of them into whatever the hell that last option was. So, hopefully that was interesting. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you learned maybe some new games or some sort of interesting concept that you could play with in your own writing. And that is all that we are doing this evening. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, obviously I'm here. So you can just ask me now, but of course you can always feel free to contact me on my email there, or I'm on the GMC Discord server just under Jasper. So if, over the weekend you're like, oh my god, I thought of this idea, feel free to get in touch. And yeah, I'm now going to pass over to Taha, who is going to be attentive and aware to introduce the next thing. But thank you guys very much.
Shoot, I don't have the mic.
Do you want the mic?
Yeah.
Do you want me to just stand really close to you?
Okay, that works. Hello everyone, I'm Taha. And I'm here to talk about the GMC Narrative Design Challenge. So, this workshop has been just a lot of theoretical stuff and whatnot. And if it's a bit hard to grasp everything immediately, we do have it streaming on YouTube right now, so you can go back through the video and look through it. And also on our Discord, we sent an announcement linking to a Notion page which has this PowerPoint, has all the links in the PowerPoint, and it also links to a page explaining the narrative design challenge. What the challenge right now is gonna be about creating a script for a game, working on the story and working on the branching narrative and whatnot. And you have 1 week to do it. So you have from now until the end of next Friday to work on your story and upload it into a forum in our Discord, so everyone can see and react to each other's stories. You can either just write about it through. You can either type it out through text in a normal script format, or you can try a few applications which allow you to kind of mess around with interactive storytelling. So we have a few recommendations here of simple and really good things you could use for interactive storytelling. One of it is Twine, which I think you can talk about.
Twine. Hey, look, it's a chart. Hey, look, it's got branching narrative in it. Wow. Does that remind you of branching narrative? So really good for using if you want to create a text-based branching narrative sort of thing. Really easy to prototype. Just okay, if this is going to lead to this choice, it's going to lead to this choice. Very, very simple, very, very effective. And another option, I mentioned it before, is Ink. And this is the scripting language that was used to create 80 Days, Heaven's Vault, and a bunch of other games. It's used by other studios. It's really great for writers because it kind of is programming, but it's kind of not. Because I personally, for example, as a writer, have no idea how to use Unity. And you might not either. If you're working with a team, you can say, use this, which can plug into Unity. And you can basically just write it like a script. And you could write in the choices and the branches and all that sort of thing to create the dialogue. It's really, really effective. Another option is Bitsy, which is a sort of a lightweight sort of little play around, make a little video RPG, just write stuff, and you don't have to worry too much about graphics. You can just get things on the page. So if you want to participate in the design challenge, it's pretty chill. It's just hey, here's a pitch. If you want to incorporate some of the stuff we talked about tonight, wouldn't it be cool if we made all of the characters sentient? Sure, you can do that. Why the hell not? But yeah, that's about it. But of course, it's not possible.
Alright. I'll have all the details of that in the Discord and whatnot. And I really appreciate it for me and for Jasper if you could fill out this narrative design workshop feedback links. Just scan that. Talk about how.
It's about how crap I was.
But yeah, thank you so much for coming. Do you have anything you want to say?
Yes, one more thing. This PowerPoint is available. Tons of links in there. If there was anything in particular that you found interesting, there's lots of links to game developer conference talks where people go into much more detail about specific concepts. So there's just tons of resources if you're interested. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for listening to this. One more thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I did mention about the freaking narrative design challenge, but there is a prompt that I just put up. So the prompt is to make the game surrounding a character, right? I have a. Can I?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna pop on this to hop onto the Notion side.
How do you want me to fill out
I can.
Look at this.
How do I? Okay. Yeah, it's simple enough, right?
Wow, using a computer. How about it?
What? Okay, why am I struggling? Why am I struggling? Okay, wait. It was in the announcements, right?
It wasn't the announcements.
Okay, here you go. I can just push this over
Yeah,
here?
yeah.
Yeah. Alright, so this is the website. I need you to stay close to me because you have the mic. This is the website, and we have, this is everything from the workshop. And if you scroll down here, it links to this page with all the information on the narrative design challenge, how to submit. It goes through, the recommended things for interactive design we mentioned earlier, plus a few extra ones just for fun. And we have the prompt here. And so the character you have to write the story about is, I have a very detailed explanation here. It's a character called Caricature, which is a cat that's 2 years old, born in 2009 in Bodrum, Turkey. Um, I went very in particular into random details, but use this how you will. I tried to keep it broad, so
Wow.
personality is optional.
What story let's say you could write specific to being a cat, huh?
But yeah, I hope you enjoy. It's we want to keep it very light. Whatever story you make, try to keep it readable or playable in under 10 minutes, so that it's not too much of a workload for you as well. Especially when you get to the point of like having branching narratives and whatnot. So yeah, do check it out. It's all on the Discord and whatnot. Yeah. Good day. Good night.
Yes. How do I get this thing off?
What?
How do I kill this?
You can just. I don't know. Oh.
Save me, Chaha.
Alright. Alright. I think maybe you can just drop it in here.
Can I just drop it? Do I just unplug this? Is that how this works?
Yeah.
Woo!
Alright.
System exit. Let's see what that does.
Does everyone have access to the Discord, by the way? Okay, nice.
Does everyone have access to the Discord? Can you get it on the Instagram?
Yeah, you can get it on the Instagram.
If you don't have access to the Discord, look us up on Instagram.